I'm going to continue on and talk about some of the big doctrines that were discussed. If we talk about the Protestant Reformation, we have to talk about justification, which is how human beings are put right with God, how it is that God justifies human beings. In other words, how he pronounces them or declares them righteous. I will summarize both the Roman Catholic view of the late Middle Ages and the Protestant view and show how they differ from one another very quickly. According to Roman Catholics, grace is given to the believer on account of Jesus Christ, and that grace is conveyed to believers through the sacraments, the 7 sacraments of the church. So it comes on the basis of Jesus Christ's extra merits that he earned through his life and death. But that grace, those merits, are conveyed through the sacraments. Over the life of a believer, he or she advances in holiness through obedience to God's commands, to penance. When they do sin, they confess and they do penance, something I mentioned before. Usually the priest will prescribe some sort of penance, either say a certain amount of prayer, certain prayers, or do certain things, restore money if money's been stolen, etc. And they participate in the sacraments. And it's through those things they advance in holiness. And then ultimately, at the judgment, the believer is justified or not by the nature of his or her grace-inspired works. So Catholics will say, these are not simply the works of a person. They're works, yes, but they're inspired by God's grace, and they're empowered by the grace of God. But ultimately, yes, you're judged by your works. And if your works are insufficient, then your sins have to be purged from you in purgatory. And if you have mortal sins, serious sins that haven't been confessed, you are in danger of hell, of condemnation. All right, in contrast, the Protestant reformers, what they sort of agreed on was this view of justification. This is how a person is declared righteous. Grace is given freely to a believer on account of Jesus Christ. So in that, they're the same as Catholics, right? Grace comes to humans through Jesus Christ, but this is where they differ. This grace is simply received by faith. A Christian person simply trusts in this gift, this free gift of salvation, trusts in God's grace given through Christ, and they are justified. Protestants will say good works may provide evidence of salvation, but they do not merit salvation. So they are never the basis of justification, as a Catholic would say. And that's the main difference. I should mention the fourth figure here, Menno Simons, lower right, representing the Anabaptist. The Anabaptist will put more stress on the need for good works, the necessity of following in the steps of Jesus. One person has put it this way, that the other reformers focus on Paul and his writings about grace, and those are where they land in the New Testament most of all. Anabaptists focus much more on the Gospels and the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's teachings there in the 4 Gospels instead of Paul. But Anabaptists will still affirm that salvation is a free gift. They will just lay greater stress on the need for good works, of following in the path of Jesus, and especially being willing to suffer for one's faith. All right, another huge topic that was debated and is still debated today, for better or worse, is God's sovereignty and humankind's free will. Calvin is known for his strong emphasis on God's sovereignty, the fact that salvation is a work of God from start to finish. Calvin, in his writings, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, he did lay stress on predestination, the fact that God chooses those who will be saved without regard to what they're going to do in their lives. But it's actually Calvin's followers in the generations that followed him who laid even more stress on predestination and made it practically the center of their theology. that everything they would say begins with God's decree. Before time, before anyone had done anything good or bad, God decreed that some would be saved and that some would be condemned. And this will be the teaching of later generations of Calvinists, those in the Reformed tradition. There was a scholar named Jacob Arminius, shown on the right here. He began his career as a Calvinist. He was a student of Theodore Beza, who was himself a follower of Calvin. But then Jacob Arminius departed from some of the key tenets of Calvinist belief and began to advocate he laid more stress on human free will and its role in salvation. In response to his teachings, which became popular in many Reformed communities, many Calvinist leaders called for a synod, a meeting, and this met at Dordrecht in 1618, 1619, also called Dort. And the Synod of Dort met together. This was actually, I believe it was after Arminius's death. I don't think he was there. And they hammered out what their response would be to the teachings of Arminius. And this is the source of the 5 Calvinist teachings, which are summed up with the acronym TULIP. They summed up their responses to Arminius in these 5 teachings. And I won't go into the whole issue, just a couple differences. Calvinists held that Christ died only for those who would be saved, only for the elect, only for those chosen. Christ didn't die for those who wouldn't respond to the gospel. So he only died for those that God had already chosen. Arminians, those who followed Arminius's teaching, hold that Christ has died for all people, even though only the elect respond to the gospel. And that belief among Calvinists is the L in TULIP, that's limited atonement. Also, Calvinists hold that God gives what's called prevenient grace, the grace one needs to feel the inclination to respond to the gospel. Right, so you hear someone preach the gospel. If God's already been working in you to make you partial to the gospel, that's called prevenient grace. Both Calvinists and Arminians believed in prevenient grace, but Calvinists believe that God only gives it to those who will be saved. Right, the condemned, the damned don't have it. Arminians would say, no, God gives prevenient grace to all people, but only some of them respond to his grace and respond to the gospel. So some of the differences. I talked about John Wesley earlier in talking about the Great Awakening. He was a famous Arminian. He followed Arminius's teaching more than Calvin. And Wesley was good friends with George Whitefield from their college days. They were both big preachers in the Great Awakening, but Whitefield was famously strongly Calvinist. Wesley was strongly Arminian. So they had that strong disagreement between one another. But after Whitefield died, Wesley spoke at Whitefield's funeral. And he said, sometimes we just need to agree to disagree. And I think that's the origin of that term, to agree to disagree. Wesley said, Whitefield was a godly man, even though we didn't agree on everything. And I think would that all Calvinists and Arminians could have that attitude towards one another. But so it goes. All right, last thing I want to talk about is the way churches are structured, which was an area of theology called Ecclesiology, church government. There were arguments throughout these years on the best type, the most biblical type of governing the church, of church government or polity. The traditional way of governing the church was something called episcopacy, which is from the Greek word episkopos, which means bishop. And episcopal polity is ruled by bishops. It's a very hierarchical structure. This is what we found from the earliest years of the church. It's how the Roman Catholic Church is structured. It's how the Church of England is structured. Another way of structuring a church is Presbyterianism. This is also, it's hierarchical, but it's constructed or comprised from the ground up. So within each local church, there is a committee, usually of elders who meet and make decisions. And then that committee sends representatives to another committee who oversees several churches. So representatives from local churches then gather in higher committees that oversee groups of churches. And sometimes there are levels even higher than that within the Presbyterian system. But it starts with the local church. It's kind of rule from the bottom rather than episcopacy, which is rule from the top down. And then there's congregationalism, which is just, it represents the independence of a local church. There is no higher committee or assembly or authority above a single church and its own elders and pastors. And we find all three kinds of structure today. By the end of the 1600s, all three of these kinds of church government were being utilized, both in Europe and in the New World.